Chapter 7. Uther Pendragon. I cannot join you in that wish, brother. I am dedicated to the belief that it is God's will that all men should strive for wisdom in themselves, not to look from some other. Merlin, speaking to King Arthur, The Mists of Avalon, Marion Zimmer Bradley. They returned to the year they had left, but not to Florida. As they looked around them, Dan asked, "Where have you brought us, Damianos? Is that another story to be unravelled?"
"Perhaps so, Dan. What you see around you are the ruins of the castle inhabited by your ancestor, King Uther Pendragon, father of King Arthur."
"We must be in Wales or England, then," Gustavo said.
"Precisely," Damianos nodded. "And if you bear with me for a few moments, I should be able to take us to the time when the story of Pendragon should be told."
He then snapped his fingers. In the blink of an eye, the three men were sitting in high-backed chairs in front of an enormous fireplace. The room resembled that of one in a medieval castle of the early centuries AD. The stone-faced walls were adorned of banners and flags of past battles. Even though the fire in the hearth warmed the room somewhat, the air was still cool. The slits high up along the ceiling provided some ventilation in this large room. Dan turned around and noticed the long table and benches alongside it, apparently ready to receive a number of dinner guests. "Are we invited to partake their supper?" he asked.
"We shall see how the evening turns out," Damianos replied. "However, first, I would like to read what your book describes regarding your ancestry, the men and women who lived in this castle."
"Is that why he was called Pendragon?" Dan asked.
"Yes, and he was to be known through the ages as King Uther Pendragon."
"And were your prediction correct?" Gustavo asked.
"Absolutely. Upon Uther's return home, he found Aurelius dead. He had been poisoned by an unknown assassin."
"When you say unknown, is that the conclusion drawn at the time or a form of cover-up?"
"Young heir of Uther, you should realize that in the century of which we speak, there was no way of knowing what could be seen as fiction. Thus, we never found the assassin, no."
Merlin looked at the three men in turn and then continued.
"Such as things were, Uther became king and ordered the construction of 2 golden dragons to adorn the entrance to the reconstructed castle, the one in which we sit presently."
Again Gustavo and Dan looked around them and now noticed the dragon adorning the tapestry of the royal house standard.
"Yes, gentlemen, King Uther demonstrated only 2 emotional attachments during his lifetime. One was the dragon who had proved to be the bearer of good portent, and the other was the wife of another."
"Really?" Dan exclaimed. "How did that happen?"
"Quite a story this one is, gentlemen, one of which I'm particularly proud, very proud indeed,"
Merlin remarked, caressing his beard again.
"You see, once relative peace had been restored in the land, Uther felt it was time to secure the frontiers of Britain and squash the Saxons' uprising with the able assistance of the then Duke of Cornwall, Gorlois. At the issue of the battles, the Duke invited Uther for a celebratory feast where his wife, Igraine, was in attendance. Uther fell in love with Igraine, which obvious relationship provoked the 2 men into a war between them. To protect his wife, Gorlois sent her to Tintagel, a castle supposedly impregnable."
"When you say supposedly impregnable, I gather it wasn't to you," Dan said to Merlin. With a chuckle, Merlin nodded.
"Not to me, as you say, young heir of Uther. When your ancestor came to see me and recounted his troubles to me, I saw it as a grave imposition of my faculties. You see, if Uther died without an heir, the future of England would be put into jeopardy. The Duke of Cornwall would not be suited to step onto the throne of this nation. It befell me to initiate a union between the 2 people who would indeed ensure progeny to the kingdom of Britannia."
"So how did you do it?" Gustavo inquired, throwing a glance in Damianos' direction. "Did Uther have to climb the walls of the fortress?" He laughed at the thought.
"Oh, no," Merlin replied. "Only had to make sure he looked like Gorlois, which was easy enough, given that the 2 men were of the same stature. One, Uther, was inside the castle and was granted access to the Duchess's chamber. Uther revealed himself to her. They spent the night together, and Igraine decided to divorce her husband the next day. However, God intervened that night, I believe."
"How?" Dan asked.
"Gorlois died that same night during the siege of his land and castle."
"Wow. Dan uttered. Are you telling me that I am the bastard son of the Duchess of Cornwall?
Not quite, Damianos put in, finally opening his mouth. You are descendant of Uther, King of Brittany, and the Duchess of Cornwall, who were united in front of God in the weeks that followed the death of Gorlois.
Dan nodded and looked down to his lap. His book was closed now. He felt as if he had come to the end of a road. He then raised his gaze to Damianos. How did we end up in Italy then, as the Ricciulli, if we were to inherit the throne of England? Damianos smiled and returned to Merlin.
Stigma will follow the infants of kings and queens, young heir of Uther, and your ancestor was no exception. King Arthur and his sister Anna were troubled souls, but their heirs sought the solace they deserved on other shores. Some of their children moved to other houses of learning and inherited other names, such as King Ludomus of Lothian, Orkney, and Norway. If you recall, their names were mentioned in the royal appointment that you have now in your possession, were they not?
Dan nodded. Yes, they were. The lineage is most complex, Merlin, and I don't know that we've even scratched the surface of our history.
You'll have time to retrace the steps of your ancestors, young heir of Uther. Each family will have given you a piece of your spirit, and God will decide when it is adequate for you to relive those lives that have borne you to this day.